It was late summer, 1945. The Pacific War was all but over, and the world waited for surrender. But in the southernmost edge of Japan's Ryukyu chain, a unit of U.S. Marines never came home. They were called Recon Company D, 31 men led by Lieutenant Jack Henson, tasked with building a forward radar outpost on a small volcanic island known then as Ishikiri. It was supposed to be routine, secure the area, set up communications, await extraction. What happened instead would become one of the most baffling disappearances in American military history. On August 5th, just weeks before Japan's official surrender, all radio contact with Camp Henson ceased. Their last message was fragmented by static, something about weather closing in, and unfamiliar movement on the ridge. Then, silence. The Navy launched reconnaissance flights, but found nothing. No smoke, no fire, no movement. A week later, the greatest typhoon in decades tore through the Ryukyus, swallowing any trace of the camp beneath walls of wind and rain. When the storm cleared, Ishikiri Island was gone from the maps, its coordinates wiped, its name replaced by a numeric grid reference. Officially, the Marines were declared missing in action. Unofficially, they were forgotten. For decades, families received little more than form letters, empty condolences from offices that no longer remembered the mission's name. But history has a strange way of resurfacing. In 2024, 80 years later, a research drone mapping the island's vegetation picked up something beneath the canopy, a metallic shape, geometric, human-made, a pattern the jungle should never have been able to form. That discovery would reopen a file sealed since the Truman administration and force historians to confront an unnerving question: what really happened to the men of Camp Henson? Seen from above, Ishikiri doesn't look like much, just a dark smudge in a turquoise sea. But beneath that green shroud lies a labyrinth of history and decay. The island is only 7 miles across, but its interior is almost impossible to penetrate. The jungle grows in layers, banyan roots like ropes, ferns taller than men, and vines that wrap around anything that tries to move through them. Locals call it Kaminari Shima, the Island of Thunder. They say the storms there never stop, that the rain falls even when the sky is clear. Few fishermen dare to land, and those who do tell stories of strange lights flickering in the trees at night, like lanterns moving against the wind. After the war, Japanese surveyors avoided Ishikiri altogether. Their reports mention magnetic interference, unexplained audio distortion, and one line later redacted entirely, voices heard near the southern ridge. The place became legend, part ghost story, part national secret. Then came the drone footage. At first, the research team thought the metallic anomaly was just wreckage from the war. But frame by frame, the image sharpened. Symmetrical trenches, squared foundations, and what appeared to be the curved frame of a Quonset hut, the kind used by U.S. Marines in the 1940 seconds. The island hadn't forgotten after all. Beneath 80 years of vines, moss, and silence, something man-made was waiting to be found. And for the first time in generations, ghosts were stirring. July 1945. The war was burning toward its end, but no one on the ground knew that yet. The U.S. Pacific Command had approved a classified mission under the codename Operation Silent Shore, a final chess move in case the invasion of Japan became unavoidable. The objective was simple on paper: deploy a small marine reconnaissance unit to a remote island south of Okinawa, build a radar and refueling station, and maintain radio silence until further orders. Lieutenant Jack Henson was only 31, a decorated veteran of Tarawa and Peleliu, steady under fire, unshakable in front of his men. He led 30 Marines, 3 engineers, and a Navy radio man, all handpicked for endurance and discretion. The island had no infrastructure, no harbor, no local population, just cliffs, jungle, and the endless hum of cicadas. Supplies came by seaplane every 10 days, weather permitting. The men built their base on the island's north shore, cutting into the thick canopy to raise aluminum Quonset huts, radio masts, and fuel drums painted with dull green camouflage. They called it Camp Henson. The first few weeks went as planned. Patrols logged nothing unusual except strange echoes on radar blips that appeared and vanished like ghosts. The radio man blamed atmospheric interference, but others swore they saw movement on the hills above camp, lights where none should be. The monsoon season arrived early. Rations spoiled. Communication with Okinawa grew faint, distorted. Each message came through laced with static, like the air itself was resisting them. On August 4th, at 2013 hours, the last transmission from Camp Henson was recorded at Pacific Command. Camp secure, storm closing in, then a burst of white noise, followed by silence. The Navy logged it as routine weather disruption. It wasn't. Within 24 hours, Operation Silent Shore would vanish from existence. The typhoon that struck the Ryukyu chain that night was one of the most violent storms ever recorded. Winds over 180 miles per hour ripped through the island, tearing trees from their roots and snapping steel like twigs. The ocean rose, swallowing entire coastlines. Radar stations across Okinawa went dark one by one, their signals erased by the storm's electrical fury. When the winds finally died 3 days later, the island chain looked like it had been scraped clean. Naval vessels searching for survivors found little more than floating debris, broken fuel drums, sections of aluminum roofing, a single lifeboat without markings. Ishikiri Island was unreachable. Every approach was blocked by jagged coral and storm surge. Weeks passed before a reconnaissance team could attempt landing. When they did, what they found made no sense. The landing beach showed no wreckage, no footprints, no signs of campfires or battle. The jungle had swallowed everything. No huts, no radio tower, no human remains, only silence, thick and suffocating. Even the sand looked disturbed, as if the ground itself had shifted. The commanding officer wrote in his report, "The island appears untouched, impossible, given the storm's path." He was right. Something about Ishikiri was wrong. Compasses spun, radios failed, and one searcher claimed to hear metal striking metal deep within the forest, though no one else heard it. After a week of fruitless searching, the Navy called off the mission. The file was stamped unrecoverable. The men of Camp Henson were officially listed as missing in action. Their families received medals in silence. Ishikiri Island was erased from active charts, replaced by open water. The world moved on, but the jungle didn't. It kept its secrets buried, waiting for someone to listen again. For decades, the story of Camp Henson existed only in fragments, an urban legend whispered among military historians and the families of the missing. There were no official reports, no casualty confirmations, no graves, just 31 names carved into a memorial wall at Quantico, and a few blurred photographs of men smiling in the Pacific Sunday. The mission, it turned out, had been scrubbed from history entirely. In 1972, a retired naval archivist named Robert Lane stumbled across a file labeled Silent Shore Restricted, Command Eyes Only. Inside were fragmented communiques, requisition orders for experimental radar parts, and a handwritten note stamped Denied Existence. It became clear that the operation had been classified so deeply, even the Navy denied it ever happened. Lane went public in 1974, but his findings were quickly seized under the National Security Act. He died the following year in what was described as a car accident on an unlit road. The families, meanwhile, were left with confusion and contradictions. One widow received a letter saying her husband had died heroically at sea. Another's report claimed, missing in combat location Okinawa Prefecture. Some were told their loved ones were unrecoverable, others non-operational casualties. No two documents matched. The bureaucratic fog grew thicker with every inquiry. By the 1,980 seconds, most families had stopped asking questions. The war was over, the heroes buried, and the files sealed. But beneath the paper trail, something was wrong. In one memo, A commander had scrawled in the margins, "Recommend full suppression site compromised. Unnatural interference." Another memo referenced post-event anomalies and magnetic corruption. It was as if someone was trying to describe something they didn't understand. For half a century, Ishikiri remained off-limits, absent from tourist maps, absent from naval charts, protected by invisible red tape. The world forgot the men of Camp Henson, but the jungle didn't, and it was about to speak. 80 years later, the story should have ended. But sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, it waits. In 2024, a team of Japanese ecologists from Kyoto University began surveying remote islands in the Ryukyu chain as part of a post-typhoon reforestation study. One of those islands was listed only as Sector 9B, a speck of green nearly erased from public satellite maps. The researchers flew drones over the canopy, expecting to record tree density and soil moisture. Instead, the sensors began detecting strange thermal signatures, angular shapes, too uniform to be natural. When they overlaid the imagery, the heat signatures formed a line, 6 rectangles, perfectly spaced, buried beneath the roots of banyan trees and volcanic soil. "Man-made," one technician whispered. The data was sent back to Kyoto for analysis, and that's when the anomalies multiplied. The metal beneath the island was magnetically charged, as if frozen mid-current, emitting a faint, rhythmic pulse. The team thought it was an error, maybe an old shipwreck buried by the storm. But the geometry didn't match anything maritime. It looked like foundations, or shelters. When the footage reached historian Kenji Takahashi, he recognized something chilling. The formation of those rectangles mirrored the standard layout of a 1,940 U.S. Marine forward operating camp. Same dimensions, same spacing, same pattern. 80 years after Operation Silent Shore vanished from the record, the jungle had given up a clue, a silent signal rising through roots and ash. The island the world had forgotten was breathing again, and whatever was buried there was finally ready to be found. The discovery spread quietly at first, a few academic emails, a handful of encrypted documents shared between Kyoto and Washington. But once the U.S. Defense POW, divided by MIA accounting agency, caught wind of the anomaly, everything changed. Within weeks, a joint U.S.-Japanese recovery mission was authorized under the guise of an ecological heritage survey. In reality, it was the first sanctioned exploration of Ishikiri Island since 1945. Leading the operation was Dr. Sarah Collins, a military anthropologist whose specialty was identifying forgotten battlefield sites across the Pacific. Calm, methodical, and fiercely determined, she'd spent years piecing together fragments of vanished history. Alongside her was Kenji Takahashi, a historian from Okinawa University and one of the last living experts on Japan's classified wartime islands. Where Collins brought science and procedure, Takahashi brought folklore, the stories passed down from fishermen who claimed to hear English voices drifting from the jungle after the war. The team arrived on Ishikiri in early spring. Their landing craft churned through murky water thick with silt and coral debris. The island was a cathedral of green vines, banyans, and moss so dense the air itself seemed to breathe. They set up a small base camp near the northern shore, not far from where Camp Henson had once stood. The ground there was strange, soft in places, as if something hollow rested beneath. "This isn't just history," Collins murmured, looking out toward the ridgeline. "It's a grave." For days, the crew mapped the terrain with drones and ground-penetrating radar, scanning for metallic anomalies. Each night, the jungle came alive with sound wind through the leaves, insects shrieking like static, branches creaking like distant footsteps. Takahashi recorded the sounds, claiming some of the patterns resembled Morse code. Collins dismissed it as coincidence. But deep down, neither of them could shake the feeling that the island wasn't welcoming them, it was warning them. On the 5th day, the radar picked up a void, a massive cavity about 10 feet below the surface, framed by metallic edges. The team began digging carefully, layer by layer, until a dull thud echoed through the earth. Collins knelt, brushing away soil with a gloved hand. What emerged was a slab of corrugated steel, warped but unmistakably human-made. Etched faintly into the metal were the words, U.S. Marine Corps property of Camp Henson. The air grew thick as the excavation widened. Beneath the slab was a tunnel entrance, collapsed on one side but intact enough to crawl through. Inside, the temperature dropped. The flashlights caught a ghostly shimmer. Rusted helmets lined against the wall, canteens fused to the rock, ration tins stamped 1945. There were fragments of uniforms, faded to the color of dust. And then Collins saw it, a grenade wedged into the wall, its pin still in place, half swallowed by the earth. "Nobody move," she whispered. For a long moment, no one breathed. Finally, the ordnance specialist confirmed it was inert, its charge long corroded. Still, the sense of danger lingered, heavy and real. The deeper they went, the more the scene resembled a moment frozen in time, a camp caught mid-breath, abandoned in an instant. On a rusted bunk, they found a name tag, Lieutenant J. Henson. Nearby, a lantern lay intact, its glass unbroken, as if waiting for someone to light it again. Every object was perfectly preserved beneath layers of volcanic ash, sealed away like a time capsule. Collins crouched beside the name tag, tracing the letters with her glove. "They didn't vanish," she said quietly. "They were buried alive." And in that dim, breathless bunker, 80 years of silence began to stir. It was Kenji who found it. Beneath a collapsed storage rack, sealed inside a rusted ammunition crate, lay something no one expected to survive 8 decades in the jungle's humidity, a small, leather-bound notebook wrapped in oilcloth. The pages were stiff but intact, the ink faded to a brown whisper. On the inside cover, written in careful block letters, Lieutenant J. Henson, Camp Log, July, August 1945. Dr. Collins read aloud, her voice trembling slightly as she turned the pages. At first, the entries were ordinary supply tallies, weather notes, updates on radar calibration. But then, the tone began to change. August 2nd, she read. Men reporting strange lights near the ridge after dark. Think it's phosphorescence or enemy scouts. Told them to keep quiet, maintain discipline. The next entry was shorter, the handwriting rougher. Lights again. Movement in the trees, no sound, no tracks. Thompson swears he heard English, but the accent's wrong. By mid-August, the notes had shifted from procedural to personal. The words fatigue and paranoia appeared again and again. Something's off. Radios cutting in and out, compass unreliable. Private Kearns refuses night watch. Says he sees faces between the branches. Collins turned to the final pages, the ink smudged by water or sweat. The handwriting was frantic now, letters sprawling beyond the lines. The jungle isn't empty. We see lights at night. Voices not ours. Men disappearing. No signs of struggle, just gone. If we disappear, it won't be the storm that takes us. The room went still. Even the cicadas outside seemed to pause. Collins closed the journal slowly, her glove leaving a faint print on the cover. Whatever happened to the men of Camp Henson, they'd felt it coming. And whatever they'd seen before, that final typhoon wasn't just nature, it was something watching them back. Back on the mainland, the discovery of the journal sent shockwaves through both governments. The U.S. released a limited statement acknowledging new findings of historical interest. But behind the scenes, classified records were being quietly reopened. In Tokyo, Kenji gained access to post-war archives previously sealed under military order. There, among faded documents and handwritten reports, he found a file marked Imperial Intelligence Detachment Ishikiri Outpost, August 1945. The Japanese had a presence on the same island, small, secret, and entirely unknown to the Americans. The file described an observation unit of 8 men sent to track unidentified Allied activity south of Okinawa. Their final report ended abruptly. Radio interference increasing. Possible detection by foreign unit. Awaiting extraction. None of them were ever seen again. Local oral histories added another layer. Fishermen from the nearby Amami coast still told stories of a battle that never happened, A brief firefight deep in the jungle that left no bodies, no shell casings, no survivors. They called it the Night of the Whispers. Villagers claimed the jungle screamed that night gunfire, lightning, then silence so complete it felt unnatural. After the war, Japanese officials quietly struck Ishikiri from their territorial maps, labeling it geologically unstable. In reality, they wanted the island forgotten. Takahashi pieced together the fragments, overlaying Japanese coordinates with the Marines' camp layout. The positions matched almost perfectly. Two forces, both stranded, both unaware of the other's full strength meeting in a storm so violent it erased their footprints in an instant. Yet something still didn't add up. The remains uncovered in the bunker were too few, too orderly. Collins said it first, her voice barely above a whisper. If there was a battle here, where are the others? The question hung in the humid air, unanswered, as thunder rolled in the distance. The island seemed to be listening. 3 days after the journal's discovery, the excavation expanded outward from the bunker. The ground itself seemed reluctant to give up what it held, roots wrapped around rusted helmets, banyan tendrils clutching fragments of steel. When the first bone surfaced, no one spoke. It was a femur, bleached pale and tangled in a strip of rotted canvas. The team expected American remains. What they didn't expect were the insignia that followed, a corroded Japanese badge fused to the same ribcage. More bones emerged, layered like a collapsed tableau, 2 bodies intertwined, one wearing remnants of a U.S. uniform, the other Japanese field gear. Not buried side by side, but together as if they'd fallen locked in combat, or perhaps clinging to each other in desperation. As days passed, the number of remains grew. Forensic specialists cataloged them meticulously, 37 partial skeletons in total, some unmistakably American, others Japanese, and a few impossible to identify. The strangest part wasn't the mix of uniforms, but the timeline. Carbon dating revealed some bones had been buried decades after 1945, a few as late as the early 1952. That's not possible, Collins said, staring at the data sheet. There were no retrieval missions, no known survivors. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. Someone had lived here long after the war ended, patching uniforms, burying their dead, maybe even defending the site from something no one recorded. A rusted M1 rifle was found with its barrel bent, as if struck by tremendous force. A Japanese canteen sat beside it, refilled recently enough for faint mineral residue to remain. It was as though fragments of 2 armies had merged into one soldiers cut off from the world, surviving together or dying together in silence. Takahashi stood over the excavation pit as the sun set behind the canopy, his voice quiet. Maybe they stopped fighting the war, he said. Maybe the island made them fight something else. No one answered. The wind moved through the trees with a sound that could almost have been breathing. It was during the 7th week, near what had been the camp's command tent, that they found the radio. Its frame was half melted, its dials fused into position, but the serial number matched those used by U.S. Marine field stations in 1945. Inside the corroded shell, a fragment of the transmission coil still clung to life, preserved beneath layers of clay. Collins insisted it be sent to a lab in Yokosuka for restoration. Weeks later, a digital reconstruction of the magnetic tape yielded something extraordinary, a sound file less than 30 seconds long. It began with static, thick, electric, alive. Then a voice, calm but strained, filtered through decades of silence. "This isn't enemy fire." The static swelled, cutting across the words like surf against rock. Then again, faintly clearer, "It's something else. Tell them. The jungle moves." The final 3 words sent chills through the room. Experts replayed the recording over and over, debating what it meant. Was it a metaphor, a reference to landslides, collapsing terrain, or some hallucinatory panic brought on by isolation? Or had Henson and his men witnessed something they couldn't explain? Environmental scientists suggested biological phenomena. The island's magnetized volcanic core causing disorientation, visual illusions, even infrasound hallucinations. Others whispered theories of biochemical exposure, echoing the classified memos that hinted at experimental interference devices. But to Takahashi, the message meant something older. He recalled an Okinawan legend of Kaminari no Mori, the Thunder Forest, where the trees shift after storms to hide the spirits of the dead. Maybe, he said softly, the island wasn't trying to kill them. Maybe it was keeping them. Collins said nothing. She simply played the tape again, the voice of a man long gone whispering through static, warning from the edge of history. Outside, the jungle swayed, as if listening. By the time the last fragments of evidence reached Washington, the truth had already been sanitized. Officially, Camp Henson was labeled a classified wartime anomaly, its findings deemed inconclusive. But Collins wasn't convinced. In the basement of the National Archives, she uncovered a restricted series of files cross-referenced under Naval Signal Interference 1945-46. Inside were requisition orders for prototype electromagnetic dispersal units, signed by high-ranking officers attached to the same division that deployed Lieutenant Henson's team. Alongside them sat chemical inventory lists, marked Biocom Echo, a codename for an experimental agent meant to scramble enemy radar by releasing ionized particles into the atmosphere. The compounds were untested, volatile, and rumored to cause hallucinations, skin corrosion, and acute psychological disorientation. Henson's unit, she realized, hadn't been sent to set up a radar post. They'd been human instruments in a test the Navy never intended to acknowledge. Another memo dated October 1945, weeks after the typhoon, confirmed her fears. Silent Shore operations terminated. All recovery assets denied clearance. Environmental contamination probable. That one line said everything. The Marines had been abandoned. Their bodies left uncollected not because they were unreachable but because they were radioactive in the most literal sense. Takahashi's findings in Tokyo mirrored hers. Japanese intercepts had detected anomalous radio emissions from Ishikiri before all signals went dark. The phrase metallic fog appeared several times in the translation, as if both sides had witnessed the same impossible phenomenon. When Collins presented her report to the Department of Defense, it was quietly dismissed. The files were resealed under a new classification, Containment Long-Term Environmental Risk. She understood what that meant. Whatever had happened on Ishikiri wasn't just a wartime tragedy, it was an experiment gone wrong, a secret buried not in shame but in fear of what still might linger beneath the soil. 2 years later, Ishikiri Island was opened briefly for a joint memorial between Japan and the United States. A small ship carried families of the missing Marines across the same waters their loved ones once patrolled. Among them was Margaret Henson, the granddaughter of Lieutenant Jack Henson, carrying the leather-bound journal found in the bunker. The air was heavy with salt and memory. As they stepped onto the island, the cicadas droned like distant engines. The government had cleared a path through the overgrowth to the excavation site now fenced off, its edges lined with flags from both nations. Collins and Takahashi stood side by side, watching as families placed flowers in the earth. For a moment, time folded in on itself, descendants standing where their ancestors vanished. Artifacts recovered from Camp Henson helmets, ration tins, even a rusted harmonica were divided between museums in Washington and Tokyo, each display titled Echoes of the Forgotten. Yet among the remains catalogued from the site, 3 DNA profiles didn't match any of the 31 Marines or the Japanese soldiers listed missing. The lab's report simply read, unknown male, estimated age 40, 50, date of death indeterminate. Collins didn't share that part with the families. The thought that some of Henson's men might have survived only to die years or decades later, alone on the island, was unbearable. As the ceremony ended, she handed Margaret the restored journal. "Your grandfather's words," she said softly. "They belong with his family now." Margaret nodded, but her eyes drifted toward the jungle, where the wind moved the trees in slow, synchronized waves, like something breathing just beneath the earth. She whispered, "He said the jungle moves." Collins looked out into the green expanse and shivered. No one replied. The memorial bells rang, echoing through the valley, fading into the same silence that had swallowed Camp Henson 80 years before. For nearly 80 years, Ishikiri Island slept. The jungle grew thick and wild, vines weaving over rusted steel, roots splitting the walls of forgotten bunkers. Storm after storm swept across its cliffs, erasing footprints, swallowing what remained of Camp Henson until even memory itself began to fade. Then, one drone flight changed everything. The footage, grainy at first, then crystalline, showed the canopy parting just enough to reveal the geometry of man-made order beneath chaos, a line of buried huts, a collapsed tower, the faint curve of a landing strip now consumed by green. The discovery pulled a forgotten story from the soil and forced the world to look again. What began as an ecological survey became an excavation of ghosts, a slow unearthing of truth and consequence. The faces of the men who vanished returned through photographs, their smiles frozen in sepia tones, their names now etched into memorials on both sides of the Pacific. Drone images fade into black and white war photos, Marines building, laughing, unaware they are stepping into legend. The same ground where they stood is now a sea of ferns, each leaf catching the light like a whisper of the past. Collins' voice echoes in narration, calm but heavy, with everything learned and everything still unknown. History, she says, doesn't disappear. It waits, buried under sand, sealed in silence, hidden in the roots of the world. She looks out over the island one last time as the wind rises, bending the trees in slow, rhythmic waves, the same motion described in Henson's final message. War doesn't just claim lives, she continues, it buries stories, some wait 80 years to be found. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.